On record November 7, 2024 at 9:05 a.m.
All right. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are back on the record in State of Indiana versus Richard Allen, 08C01-2210, MR1. I'll show the defendant shear in person with counsel. The state shear by the prosecutor and his deputies. All of the members of the jury have reassembled. Are we ready to do closing arguments, Mr. McClelland?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Rossi?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anything we need to talk about before we bring in the jury?
No, Your Honor.
No, ma'am.
And just a reminder, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, again, I appreciate yesterday you were very quiet. I would appreciate that continued compliance. There's a lot of officers in the back of the courtroom that will not hesitate to tap you on the shoulder and ask you to leave if you cannot remain silent throughout the course of the proceedings. It's important that the jury pay attention to the attorneys in the well of the courtroom and not be distracted by noise or commotion out in the audience, so please, maintain your composure. Gentlemen.
All rise.
Jury in at 9:07 a.m.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to see you back this morning. I hope you had a pleasant evening. Again, as we parted company last evening, and you had access to your phones for purposes of communicating with your family and checking your work email, I would ask you the following, again, set of questions. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you read, seen, or heard any media accounts concerning this case?
All jurors respond in the negative.
Have you discussed this case with anyone?
All jurors respond in the negative.
Have you permitted anyone to discuss this case with you?
All jurors respond in the negative.
Have you conducted any research into this case?
All jurors respond in the negative.
And finally, has anybody persisted in attempting to discuss this case with you?
All jurors respond in the negative.
All right. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your continued compliance with the court's directives. As I told you yesterday when we broke, you've now heard all of the evidence in the case, and the next step in the proceeding is argument and instructions, after which you will retire to deliberate. The way that we'll be presenting the balance of the case to you is as follows. You now have in your possession now a copy of the court's final instructions. I'm going to read the first dozen or so pages of those instructions. Those are the case-specific instructions that deal directly with Mr. Allen, the charges that were filed against him, the statutory elements and definitions that go with that. Once I'm done with that, the attorneys will present their final arguments. Since the state bears the burden of proof, the state is entitled by law to both open and to close the final argument, and in between, you would hear from the defense. The hope is that as you listen to the attorney's final arguments, you already have a very specific framework of the law at your disposal as you listen to the arguments of counsel. Once they're done with their arguments, I'll present the balance of the instructions to you. Those are at the back of your packet. Those are the more general instructions on how to deliberate and weigh the evidence that you've seen. Again, you have copies of these instructions and you may follow along if you wish. And I'll just tell you in advance, the arguments are gonna be rather lengthy in time, and obviously, I'm not gonna expect you all to sit there for 6 hours or 5 hours or however long it takes, so we will be taking a break. When the state has concluded with its first argument, we'll take a break. The defendant will present his argument, and we'll take a break. And then the state will present the balance of their argument, and we may be taking a break. It just kind of depends on where we're at time-wise. So just so you know, we will be taking breaks. Don't panic, think you gotta sit over there all that time. Again, I am required by law to read these instructions to you, and you may follow along with them, if you wish. It is the duty of the court to instruct you in writing at this time concerning the matters of law necessary for your information in giving your verdicts. Since this is a criminal case, the Constitution of the state of Indiana makes you the judges of both the law and the facts. Though this means that you are to determine the law for yourselves, it does not mean that you have the right to make, repeal, disregard, or ignore the law as it exists. The instructions of the court are the best source as to the law applicable to this case. In deciding this case, you must determine the facts from a consideration of all of the evidence and the law from these instructions, and find your verdicts accordingly. All of the law of this case has not been embodied in any one instruction, therefore, in construing any single instruction, you should consider it with all others given. This is a criminal case brought by the state of Indiana against Richard Allen. The case was commenced when informations were filed charging the defendant with count 1, felony murder, a felony, count 2, felony murder, a felony, count 3, murder, a felony, and count 4, murder, a felony. Those informations, omitting formal parts, read as follows. Count 1, on February 13, 2017, in Carroll County, Indiana, Richard Allen did kill another human being, to wit, Abby, while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. Count 2, on February 13, 2017, in Carroll County, Indiana, Richard Allen did kill another human being, to wit, Libby, while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. Count 3, on February 13, 2017, in Carroll County, Indiana, Richard Allen did knowingly or intentionally kill another human being, to wit, Abby. Count 4, on February 13, 2017, in Carroll County, Indiana, Richard Allen did knowingly or intentionally kill another human being, to wit, Libby. The crime of murder is defined by law as follows. A person who kills another human being while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping commits felony murder, a felony. Before you may convict the defendant, the state must have proved each of the following beyond a reasonable doubt. 1. The defendant, Richard Allen, 2. Killed, 3. Abby, 4. While committing or attempting to commit kidnapping, which is defined as a person who knowingly or intentionally removes another person by force or threat of force from one place to another. If the state failed to prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find the defendant not guilty. If the state did prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you may find the defendant guilty of count 1, felony murder, a felony. The crime of murder is defined by law as follows: a person who kills another human being while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping commits felony murder, a felony. Before you may convict the defendant of count 2, the state must have proved each of the following beyond a reasonable doubt. 1. The defendant, Richard Allen, 2. Killed, 3. Libby, 4. While committing or attempting to commit kidnapping, which is defined as a person who knowingly or intentionally removes another person by force or threat of force from one place to another. If the state failed to prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find the defendant not guilty. If the state did prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you may find the defendant guilty of count 2, felony murder, a felony. The crime of murder is defined by law as follows: a person who knowingly or intentionally kills another human being commits murder, a felony. Before you may convict the defendant of count 3, the state must have proved each of the following beyond a reasonable doubt. 1. The defendant, Richard Allen, 2. Knowingly or intentionally, 3. Killed, 4. Abby. If the state failed to prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find the defendant not guilty. If the state did prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you may find the defendant guilty of count 3, murder, a felony. The crime of murder is defined by law as follows: a person who knowingly or intentionally kills another human being commits murder, a felony. Before you may convict the defendant of count 4, the state must have proved each of the following beyond a reasonable doubt. 1. The defendant, Richard Allen, 2. Knowingly or intentionally, 3. Killed, 4. Libby. If the state failed to prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find the defendant not guilty. If the state did prove each of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you may find the defendant guilty of count 4, murder, a felony. Intentionally or knowingly is defined by statute as follows: WS. A person engages in conduct intentionally if, when he engages in this conduct, it is his conscious objective to do so. A person engages in conducting knowingly if, when he engages in this conduct, he is aware of a high probability that he is doing so. Direct evidence means evidence that directly proves a fact without an inference and which in itself, if true, conclusively establishes a fact. Circumstantial evidence means evidence that proves a fact from which an inference of the existence of another fact may be drawn. An inference is a deduction of fact that may logically and reasonably be drawn from another fact or group of facts. It is not necessary that facts be proved by direct evidence. Both direct and circumstantial evidence are acceptable as a mean of proof. Where proof of guilt is by circumstantial evidence only, it must be so conclusive in character and point so surely and erringly to the guilt of the accused as to exclude every reasonable theory of innocence. The credibility of a witness may be attacked by introducing evidence that, on some former occasion, the witness made a statement, written statement, in former testimony testified, or acted in a manner inconsistent with his or her testimony in this case. Evidence of this case may be considered by you in deciding the value of the testimony of the witness. Under the law of the state of Indiana, a person charged with the commission of a crime is a competent witness to testify in his own behalf. However, a person charged with the commission of a crime cannot be compelled to testify and is under no duty or obligation to testify. The fact that the defendant did not testify raises no presumption of any kind against him. It shall not be commented upon, referred to, or in any manner considered by the jury in determining the guilt or innocence of the defendant. For purposes then of the initial final argument, Mr. McClelland.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, February 13th, 2017, is a day that this community will never forget. It's the day that Abby and Libby went to the trails for a walk and never returned, the day that both of them were murdered by Richard Allen. 3 weeks or so ago, we told you that we would give you the evidence to convict Richard Allen, and the state has done just that. It's been a long trial, and so I want to go over a few of those pieces of evidence with you today. This all started on February 13th of 2017. Becky Patty was at home with Libby, and Abby had spent the night before. Both Abby and Libby were home off of school that day and playing around the house, playing with the new puppy that Libby had gotten not long ago. Abby and Libby had the idea to go to the trails. They asked their grandma, Becky, if they could go, and Kelsey offered to give them a ride. Last thing that Libby said to Becky was, "Grandma, it'll be okay," and they headed to the trail. On the way to the trail, there on Snapchat, Libby was posting pictures. The plan was then for them to go to the trail, and then for their Libby's dad, Derek, to pick them up later that day. Kelsey dropped them off at about 1:48 p.m. We can tell that from the phone data that Libby's phone is unplugged at about 1:48, and, shortly after, she's dropped off at the trail. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Derek arrives at the trail to pick up the girls, but he can't find them. He walks the trails. He goes to the Mononhide Bridge. He calls Libby's phone several times. Can't find the girls. At 3:30, Derek calls Becky and tells her that he can't find the girls, and the families get involved in the search. Anna Williams is contacted. No one can find the girls. Sometime after 5, the family calls law enforcement to report the girls are missing. We heard from MITCH Catron, the first one to respond. He took the call. He was at the station when the call came in. He goes to 625 and proceeds down the private drive to look for the girls around the Mononhide Bridge. He continues down the drive and goes to Brad Weber's house, and he speaks to Brad Weber. Brad Weber says, "Yeah, look around my property. Look all you want, no problem." He gives a switch a quick search around the property, but finds nothing. Other law enforcement join in, the fire department joins in, family members, community members join in for the search, and the search goes till 2 a.m. on the 14th. And you heard from several of these searchers and the law enforcement officers that, at this point, no one is looking for 2 dead bodies, they're looking for 2 girls. No one thought anything bad had happened to Abby and Libby. That doesn't happen around here. It's a small community, these kind of things don't happen. The search resumes on the 14th around 7 a.m., and it continues around noon, until Pat Brown calls Steve Mullen and notifies him that he found the girls, that he found Abby and Libby. Deputy Jonkola was the first on scene. When he arrived at the cemetery, he made his way down to the creek. He met with Pat Brown and other searchers, and they pointed to clothes in the creek, clothes that they had found, a shoe, a tie-dyed shirt. When he was speaking to the members of the creek, they pointed back towards the cemetery, to where the bodies of Abby and Libby were located. Deputy Jonkola testified that he walked right past them, and wasn't even able to see them from his vantage point, that they were hidden. He walked to where the bodies were, and he secured the scene. He didn't get too close, but he observed that both Abby and Libby were dead, that their necks were cut. And remember this point for later, that he testified that the Carroll County Sheriff's Department carried 9mm firearms, not .40 caliber. Once Jonkola found the bodies, or located the bodies, he called other law enforcement. Crime scene technicians arrived, and they started to process the scene, they started to document the scene, they started to take pictures, they started to collect evidence. Now, these next pictures are hard to see, but this is what they saw. As they processed the scene, they did so carefully, addressing one girl, and then the next, carefully documenting everything they found. They collected a phone that was underneath a shoe underneath the body of Abby, a phone that was covered in leaves and water and dirt. They also collected a bullet that was found between the bodies of Abby and Libby. The phone was immediately taken and processed. The information from the phone was extracted. From the phone, they found a video, the last video on the camera roll. By playing, we were able to determine from the download of the phone that the video was taken at 2:13 p.m. on February 13, 2017. The video shows the moment Abby and Libby were kidnapped, the moment they were forced down the hill by the guy in the video, Bridge Guy. You can hear the fear in their voice, see the fear in Abby's face. He forced them down the hill with a gun he used to intimidate them, to scare them into doing what he wanted them to do. He used them to let them know that if they didn't comply, he was gonna use that gun. You hear in the video, guys, the racking of a gun. Down the hill. We know there's a gun involved from the girl's own words. That be a gun. We also know there's a .40 caliber bullet found at the crime scene between the bodies of the girls. And so law enforcement takes that video, and they enhance that video. But before they do that, they take screenshots in an attempt to get a better look at Bridge Guy. These screenshots are in sequential order. The first one, you don't see Bridge Guy. The very next frame you do. He continues to follow Abby, and something in Libby sent something in Libby told her that she needed to film this, that she needed to get out her camera and record this. And once the video was sent off and enhanced, this is what we found. By playing, the enhanced video gives you a better image of what Libby recorded, the fact that Abby was being followed by Bridge Guy, the fact that he told him to go down the hill, the fear in Abby and Libby's voice, the fear in Abby's face. And so law enforcement began to interview people that were on the trail that day. They talked to Rayleigh Voorhees and Bree Wilbur. Heard from Bree Wilbur that when she came onto the trail, she began at the Freedom High Bridge, or the Freedom Bridge, and she took a picture there at 12:25 p.m. That's when they got on the trail, and they walked on the trail towards the Monon High Bridge. And when they got to the Monon High Bridge, it was about 12:43 p.m., and she took a picture when she got there. And then, they turned around and walked back towards the Freedom Bridge. As they did, they talked, they took pictures, and near the end of their journey, they took a picture at a bench at 1:26 p.m. After that picture, Bree Wilbur testifies that she sees a man on the trail. You heard from Rayleigh Voorhees and Bree Wilbur, they both see the same man. They describe him as a creepy guy, he looked angry, he didn't respond or make eye contact, like he was walking with a purpose. We then heard from Betsy Blair. She was walking the trail that day, and she had a Fitbit on, and she told you that she went to the trail once, left to use the restroom, came back, walked to the Monon High Bridge, and when she got there, she noticed a man on the first platform on the bridge. She arrived at the trail around 1:45, and was there till about 2:15. She arrived at the Monon High Bridge around 2 o'clock. She testified she entered through the Mears entrance, and went right to the Monon High Bridge, and again, as gets there, she sees a man on the bridge on the first platform, and she testified that he seemed to be watching for someone. As she turns around to walk back toward the Mears entrance, she passes Abby and Libby. Then you heard from Sarah Carbaugh. She was driving on 300 North at around 4 p.m. She sees a guy walking down the side of the road who was muddy and bloody, looked like he had just slaughtered a pig. He avoids eye contact, his head is down, his hands are in his pockets. All the people interviewed that you heard from give a little bit different description of who they saw on that trail that day, but they are adamant that the person they saw was Bridge Guy. Bridge Guy from the video from Libby's phone. There's no doubt in their mind. Bridge Guy who kidnapped Abby and Libby. Then we heard from Steve Mullen, who viewed the Hoosier Harvest tour video. He was able to observe Kelsey's car, Betsy Blair's car, Sarah Carbaugh's car, which confirmed the time that they were at the trail. Kelsey German passes the Hoosier Harvest store headed toward the Mears entrance at 1:49 p.m. Betsy Blair is heading back to the trails for her second trip at 1 hour 46 minutes and 20 seconds, and then she's leaving at 2:18. And then Sarah Carbaugh's vehicle is seen at 3:56. This video confirmed the times that those witnesses testified about when they were on the trail and when they saw Bridge Guy. The phone found at the scene was then further examined by First Sergeant Christopher Cecil. He did an extraction of the phone and a full analysis of what he found. He was able to locate health app data, Snapchat information, location data, more information about the video, and from this information, we know that Abby and Libby got to the trail around 1:48 p.m. And we know from each time that Libby logs onto Snapchat that it gives a GPS location of where she's at. And First Sergeant Cecil testifies they will track that as they go down the trail towards the Monon High Bridge. And the health app data confirms that there's movement, that they're moving as they get to the trails. He then analyzes the video. We know from the video again that it was taken at 2:13 and 51 seconds p.m. on February 13th, and he talks about the GPS location of that video, and it shows that it's at the Monon High Bridge. And so we're able to map Libby's location, where she goes, until the end of the Monon High Bridge. And we show movement until 2:32 p.m. The phone stops moving, doesn't move after that, registers no movement on the health app data. So where are we at that point? Can you bring up the map, please? So I want to go over the timeline that we have up to this point. 12:25. Bree Wilbur arrives at the Freedom Bridge. She and the other girls are walking towards the Monon High Bridge. At 12:43, Bree Wilbur arrives at the Monon High Bridge and takes a picture, and that picture's timestamped. They then turn around and head back towards the Freedom Bridge. At 1:26, Bree Wilbur takes a picture at the bench on the trail, somewhere in this area. Indicates, after that, they run into Bridge Guy. Betsy Blair passes the Hoosier Harvest store on the way to the Mears entrance at 1:46, and she begins her walk towards the Monon High Bridge. She gets to the Monon High Bridge, turns around, and heads back to the Mears entrance. We know that Kelsey's car is headed this way at 1:48, right after she drops off Libby and Abby at the Mears entrance. So Libby and Abby start their walk down toward the Monon High Bridge. 2 o'clock, Betsy Blair reaches the Monon High Bridge. She sees the man on the first platform. She turns around and heads back to the Mears entrance, and as she does, she passes Abby and Libby proceed out onto the Monon High Bridge. We know this from the phone information and the Snapchat GPS location. And then, at 2:13, the video begins, the video that Libby took with her phone, the video that shows them being kidnapped by Bridge Guy. And then, at 2:32, the phone stops moving. We then know Sarah Carbaugh, traveling to the west on 300 North, and she sees a guy that's muddy and bloody, like he had just slaughtered a pig, and she passes the Hoosier Harvest store at 3:56. Actually, I think Sarah Carbaugh's going this way, I apologize. So she passes the Hoosier Harvest store at 3:56, and then sees Bridge Guy, who is muddy and bloody. So at this point, we know that Bridge Guy is the guy on the video that Libby took, and that he's the one who kidnapped Abby and Libby, and that after that, they're dead. So if we can determine who Bridge Guy is, we can determine who killed Abby and Libby. Bridge Guy is guilty of felony murder. In the act of kidnapping, Abby and Libby died. He's guilty of felony murder. So fast forward to 2022. Kathy Shank comes across a leads form. She's a volunteer who's assisting with organizing the numerous tips and files that were involved in this investigation. She comes across this lead sheet from Dan Doolin, and it sticks out to her. It immediately strikes her as something she's not seen before, something that has not been followed upon. She found a lead sheet about a man who was on the trail on February 13th between 1:30 and 3:30, and that man had run into girls on the trail, Bree Wilbur and Rayleigh Voorhees. Kathy immediately took this tip to Tony Liggett. This tip stuck out to Tony Liggett because he knew that who the girls had run into was Bridge Guy, and if we could find Bridge Guy, we could find the killer, and all indications pointed to this being Bridge Guy. So Tony Liggett got with Steve Mullen and began to follow upon this tip. This tip identified the man who was on the trail on February 13th between 1:30 and 3:30 as Richard Allen. So they tried to verify the information. They call in Dan Doolin, they look at his reports. He typed up a narrative from what he had found that day. He downloaded a B&B picture of Richard Allen. Steve Mullen went to the Hoosier Harvest store. The information he found in the B&B that Richard Allen owned a 2016 black Ford Focus, and, from your questions, we were able to determine that that is the only 2016 black Ford Focus registered in Carroll County in 2016 and 2017. So Steve Mullen goes to the Hoosier Harvest Store video, and he finds a car that matched the description of the car owned by Richard Allen. Tony Liggett then goes to CVS, where Richard Allen works, and he takes pictures of that car, and they compare those pictures to what they find on the Hoosier Harvest Store, and Steve Mullen testified that one clue that he was able to recognize is those wheels on the car, the fact that light is emitted through the wheels on the car, and he testified that this car matches the description of Richard Allen's 2016 black Ford Focus. The timestamp on this, on the Hoosier Harvest Store video, 1:27 p.m., falls in line with what Richard Allen told Dan Doolin in 2017, that he got to the trails around 1:30. So October 13th of 2022, Steve Mullen and Tony Liggett call Richard Allen in for an interview. You got to see the entire interview, you got to see it for yourself. Richard Allen confirms on that day that he was wearing the same clothes that Bridge Guy was wearing on February 13th of 2017, confirms that he's wearing a blue or black Carhartt jacket, jeans, and boots. He confirms that he was on the trails that day, and he actually says that, "I went not only on the trails, but out onto the Monon High Bridge, out to the first platform." Exactly what Betsy Blair told you. He also states that he didn't see anybody else on the trail except for the 3 girls that he ran into, didn't see any other males, didn't see any other group of girls, just those 3 girls. Now, in this interview, he did change his time. Instead of 1:30 to 3:30, he changed it from 12:30 to 1:30, and he's cooperating. And as the interview goes on, he becomes more aggressive, he becomes more hostile. As the investigators start to confront him with evidence, he becomes angry, he refuses to let them search his phone. He refuses to let them search his house. And then asked if Bridge Guy's him, he states, "Well, if that picture's taken with the girl's phone, it's not me." Based on the information law enforcement had at that point, had got a search warrant and searched his home. In the home, we found a 2016 black Ford Focus. You can see the light emitting through the rims. Steve Mullen said that was important in identifying the car in the Hoosier Harvest Store video. Also find several knives and box cutters. Find a blue Carhartt jacket, surprise, surprise, same jacket Bridge Guy is wearing. Find various cell phones. Find a Hope box with a .40 caliber Winchester bullet in it, again same brand and caliber found at the crime scene between the 2 girls, in a Hope box filled with mementos, pictures, keepsakes. Also find a .40 caliber Sig Sauer firearm, same caliber as the bullet found at the crime scene between the 2 girls. The Bridge Guy starter kit, blue Carhartt jacket, .40 caliber Winchester round in that Hope box, .40 caliber Sig Sauer gun. Now, Richard Allen did have other .40 caliber ammunition in his house, but that brand was Blazer. The only Winchester Smith & Wesson Winchester round he had in his house was in a Hope box with OT her mementos and other keepsakes. Again, the same brand and caliber of the round found at the crime scene. Also found pictures where he often visited the Monon High Bridge. He's familiar with the area, visited oftentimes with his family. Through the CRCH, we found a lot of electronic devices. We searched those devices. First Sergeant Christopher Cecil told you he searched several or extracted several of Richard Allen's devices, but one that was missing was the phone that he had in 2017. We know that because Dan Doolin took down the identification number for that phone, and all the phones we searched in the house, when we searched in 2022, none of them matched that phone. But in some of those phones, we found a Google search from Richard Allen from April 17th of 2022. He searches Delphi, Indiana News at 10:47 p.m. and immediately after that he searched for "Should I die now? Die now? Should I die now?" And again, "Should I die now?" The gun is sent to the lab to be tested. It's tested by Melissa Oberg. She's got 16 years of experience with the Indiana State Police Lab on testing firearms. She's able to conclude that the bullet found at the scene between the 2 girls was cycled through Richard Allen's .40 caliber Sig Sauer, that the ejector marks, the extractor marks, and the chamber face all matched Richard Allen's gun, that the bullet from the scene came from Richard Allen's gun. Now, through the investigation, she examined all types of guns. She testified about that, and she was not able to conclude that the bullet found at the scene was cycled through any of those guns except Richard Allen's gun. Oh, and her results were verified 3 times by her boss, who's the former president of AFTE. We've heard a lot about AFTE. One more thing, she testified in her career that she'd never been wrong. See how the pieces are starting to fall into place? See how the evidence is starting to confirm and reaffirm that Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. Not only do we have him on the trails at the time, we know W have a bullet that ties him to the crime scene. So Richard Allen comes back for an interview on October 26th of 2022. He confirms, "I've never loaned my gun out to anybody. I never loaned any of my ammunition out to anybody. I never loaned my car or my clothes out to anybody." States he'd never been mushroom hunting in the area where the girls were found. He has no explanation of how his bullet from his gun ended up between the bodies of Abby and Libby, 6 inches from Libby's foot. There is no explanation except that the bullet came from his gun when he racked the gun to intimidate the girls right before he killed them. That's the explanation. much like he racked it at the top of the Monenhigh Bridge when he forced them down the hill. He was using the gun as a way to force the girls to comply with what he wanted them to do. He was using that power over the girls. And you saw, as he was confronted with these things, he became angrier and angrier. And then his wife was brought in, and you saw that interaction with him and his wife. You saw how he tried to manipulate her. You know I didn't do this. Tried to convince her. And at the end of that interview, he's arrested. And so at this point in the investigation, we're able to place Richard Allen at the bridge at the time the girls were kidnapped and able to confirm that he is Bridge Guy and that he ordered the girls down the hill. Further able to confirm that he racked his gun and lost a bullet at the location where the girls were murdered. Now, when he's arrested, he's moved to the Department of Correction for his safety. You heard Dr. Martin testify. To keep him safe, that was our goal. Safe from himself and safe from other inmates. He was moved there and, eventually, he was sent to Westville Correctional Facility. And that could have been the case. That could have been all that we have here to present to you today. But it's not, because once he gets to Westville, he starts to confess. But before he does that, on April 2nd of 2023, he has a phone call to his mom where he confesses he's given himself to Jesus, he's found the Lord, and it's important for him to tell his mom this. Not only tell his mom, but make sure that his mom tells Kathy, his wife. The very next day, a phone call to Kathy. I did it! I killed Abby and Libby, in part by playing. The phone call that he made to this wife, unprovoked, unpressured, of his own free will. Kathy, I did it. I killed Abby and Libby. After that, he continues to confess. He writes a letter to the warden. I'm ready to confess to killing Abby and Libby. I hope I get to have an opportunity to tell the families I'm sorry. He then meets with Dr. Walla on April 5th of 2023. Dr. Walla writes down that Richard Allen states, I killed Abby and Libby, I'm sorry, and proceeded to cry, and he cried off and on throughout the session. He reported committing the murders on his own. He stated he made sure that they were dead, because he didn't want them to suffer. He reported not knowing why he did it, but stated he knew his intentions were sexual in nature. I don't think I had sex with him, he stated, but also said, if he did, he didn't remember. He mentioned not knowing the ages of the victims, but reported they were at least 18 or 19 years of age, but could have been as young as 11. He reported being selfish all his life, and being a coward, and that he got scared and took their lives in order to preserve his own. He stated he hoped he could apologize to the families of the victims, and wished he could go back and change his actions. And we heard from Dr. Walla that on that day no odd behavior until after his attorney visits, and the sudden shift in presentation was purposeful, and that he was not suffering from psychosis when he made this admission. He goes on, several confessions, you're gonna be able to read these, but April 7th of 2023, a door sheet. God, I'm so glad nobody gave upon me after I killed Abby and Libby. I, Richard Matthew Allen, killed Abby and Libby all by myself, nobody helped me. I'm not crazy, I'm only acting like I'm crazy. April 8th from the door sheet, I'm ready to confess. I swear to God, I killed Abby and Libby. April 9th, I killed Abby and Libby. Funniest joke is how I killed them. I got what I deserve for what I did, and I hope I burn in hell for what I did. April 22nd, I killed those girls, so I have to kill myself. April 23rd, I killed Abby and Libby. My wife wasn't involved. I would like to confess. April 26th, I killed Abby and Libby. And April 29th, said he killed the girls in Delphi with a box cutter that he stole and left in the trash at CVS, that he wants to write a confession, and that was only planning to rape them, but he got scared and panicked and killed them instead. He then meets with Dr. Walla again on May 3rd of 2023, and he gives an even more detailed confession. Allen reported wanting to confess to his crime, and he wanted to tell his story. He reported seeing his parents the morning of the crime. He was supposed to go eat lunch with them, but opted out and bought himself a six-pack. He drank 3 of those beers and finished theirs later. He said, I bundled up. Once I got to the trail, I laid in wait. He reported seeing the girls and following them on the bridge. He reported doing something with his gun and stated, I think that's where the bullet fell out. I ordered them down the hill. His intention was to rape the girls, and mentioned he thought they were older than their biological ages. Allen said he saw a van and that scared him and caused him not to follow through with raping the girls, but instead, forcing them to cross the creek and then cutting their necks. He indicated again, I wanted to make sure they were dead. He reported covering the bodies with tree branches, and he exited the area by keeping off the trail, as not to be seen. He said he returned to his vehicle, which was parked at a nearby building, and he continued living his life after time passed, cause he hadn't been caught. We get to May 10th, you have a phone call to Kathy. You know I need you to know that I did this. It's okay, honey, I did it. I killed Abby. Then May 17th, the phone call you heard to his mom. I'm just worried that you guys aren't going to love me because of the fact that I said that I did it. Mom, I wouldn't sit here and tell you I did it, if I didn't. In part by playing. Again, a phone call that's unprovoked, he does it of his own free will, not suffering from psychosis. The phone call shows that he also trusts Dr. Walla, his therapist, and he's meeting with her every day. After this, he continues to confess, to admit that he killed Abby and Libby. Another phone call on June 5th to this wife. June 18th. You know why I'm here. I killed Abby and Libby. June 21st. And then finally, on February 4th, when he's moved to Wabash Correctional Facility, he is sorry for killing the girls. Now, during these times, the time that he's making these confessions, we heard testimony from Brian Harshman that he's listening to all these phone calls. He's watching the videos from Westville and from Wabash and from Cass County, and he's listening as Richard Allen makes these confessions to his mom and his wife. He also reads over the reports from Dr. Walla, 2 reports that I showed you earlier, 2 reports that include confessions and details of those confessions, and he said he listened to over 700 phone calls. He reviews all the reports, reviewed these phone calls, and as he's going through Dr. Walla's report, he notices something, a detail that he didn't know before, a detail that wasn't in police reports, that wasn't put out, and a detail about Richard Allen being scared after he saw a van, a detail only the killer would know. So he followed upon it. He thought Richard Allen may have seen the van on 625, and specifically the private drive, where 625 turns into the private drive. As we said, that private drive leads to the home of Brad Weber. That's the only home it leads to. So he started to do some research, and he looked up Brad Weber's BMV information from 2017, and he found that he owned a van from February of 2017. And so Steve Mullen and Brian Harshman, they called Brad Weber in for an interview. They want to follow upon this information. Before that, they noticed that Brad Weber had given an interview back on February 17th of 2017, where he said he was at work that day, on February 13th of 2017, till 2:02 p.m., and then he clocked out, and he got home sometime around 2:30. When they re-interviewed Brad Weber, he said the same thing, clocked out at 2:02, got home sometime around 2:03 to 2:30. You even had heard Brad Weber testify twice that he left work at 2:02, went straight home, got home sometime around 2:30. You also heard from Brad Weber that on that day, February 13th, 2017, he was driving his van, and that the route he took to his house was down that private drive, and that when he would have been on that private drive is the exact time Richard Allen would have been there with the 2 girls. That is the van that he saw that spooked him. Something only the killer would know, and Richard Allen confessed to it with Dr. Walla. Finally, let's not forget that Brian Harshman, in listening to these over 700 phone calls, he got a feel for Richard Allen's voice. He told you that when Richard Allen was talking on the phone with his mom and his wife, his rate, his demeanor, his tone was all the same when he made the confessions as when he's talking about mundane, everything things. And finally, he told you, as part of his investigation, he watched the video from Libby's phone, and he watched it dozens of times, and he told you on the stand there is no doubt in his mind that voice on that video is Richard Allen's, that Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. And now all the pieces are clear, all the pieces are put together. So what does the state have to prove? Count 1 is murder. The defendant, Richard Allen, killed Abby while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping, which is defined as the person who knowingly or intentionally removes another person by force or threat of force from one place to another. Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. Richard Allen used his gun to force the girls down the hill. He kidnapped them and later murdered them. We call this felony murder. The murder is committed during the commission of a felony. That's what Richard Allen did. Count 2 is the same, but with Libby, he not only forced Abby down the hill, he forces Libby down the hill. Count 3, the defendant knowingly or intentionally killed Abby. He slit their throat. He waited to make sure they were dead, and he left behind his calling card, a bullet from his gun. Count 4, murder, again, knowingly or intentionally killed Libby February 13th, 2017, a day that started out like any other day, a day where Libby decided to go to the trail with her best friend Abby and enjoy being outside, but a day that Bridge Guy stole their youth and the life away from both Abby and Libby. The state has showed you that Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. Richard Allen went on the trail that day with his .40 caliber Sig Sauer, that he arrived around 1:30, that he ran into Bree Wilbur and Railway Voorhees, and that he was grumpy, creepy, and walking with a purpose, and that as he continued down the trail, he went out on the Monon High Bridge to the first platform, and that's where Betsy Blair sees him. She sees him on the Monon High Bridge on the first platform, and she testifies he's there waiting for someone. And as she returns to the Mears entrance where she came in, she passes Abby and Libby on their way to the Monon High Bridge. Richard Allen lies in wait. He waits for Abby and Libby, and then he follows them across the Monon High Bridge. And as Libby reaches the end of the bridge, she looks back and sees Abby is being followed by Richard Allen. Something in Libby caused her to turn her phone on and record the man following Abby, some feeling. She sensed this wasn't right. Richard Allen approaches the girls, he racks his gun, and orders them down the hill. There was nobody else on the trail that day during that time that matches the description of Bridge Guy except Richard Allen. We also know from Brian Harshman that Richard Allen is the voice on the video. We know from the hard data from the phone that the video that Libby took was at 2:13 p.m. at the end of the Monon High Bridge. Richard Allen used his gun and his power, and he forces those girls down the hill. As they go down the hill, his intention is to rape them. We know that when he gets to the bottom of the hill, there is a pause. He begins to have his way with them. If you take a look at the health app data, there's a pause in the movement for 7 minutes. He has 7 minutes with him. But before he can finish his deed or his deeds, he sees a van. Brad Weber's coming home from work down his private drive to his home, and he scares Richard Allen. Then Richard Allen forces the girls across the creek to a spot in the woods, a secluded spot, and he kills them. He cuts their neck. Libby is completely naked. Abby's naked at one time, but when she's found, she's dressed partially in Libby's clothes. Once they got him into the woods, he used his gun again, and he racks his gun, and he drops a bullet, and then it happens. He cuts Libby's throat sick first, and as she clings to life, she's grabbing for her throat, struggling to stay alive. We heard from Pat Cicero, and you saw in the picture, she begins to cry, and there's a blood outlined in a tear. Then he focuses his attention on Abby, and he cuts her throat, and he watches her die slowly. He then crawls out of the woods, and walks back to his vehicle down 300 North like nothing happened. Sarah Carbaugh saw him, said he was muddy, bloody, like he just slaughtered a pig. And for 5 years, he lives in this community. 5 years he lives amongst us. But what he didn't realize is that he left behind a cartridge from his gun, a cartridge that was cycled through his gun, but he also left behind Libby's cell phone. Those 2 key pieces of evidence led investigators to him. And then finally, if that wasn't enough to convince you, we have his confessions, where he states over and over and over again, I killed Abby and Libby. And then he goes into detail how he does it, what his mindset is when he's doing, and walks you through what he does to those girls. And in at least one of those admissions, he gives you detail that only he could have, only the killer could have. And so I believe the evidence firmly convinces you that Richard Allen is Bridge Guy and that he killed Abby and Libby. I'm gonna ask you to consider all the evidence and enter a conviction of guilty against our Richard Allen on all 4 counts. Counts 1 and 2 for felony murder. Counts 3 and 4 for murder. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, as I indicated, we will go ahead and take a break, give you an opportunity to get up and move around a little. You may discuss the evidence, but please, don't deliberate, and only have those discussions if all 15 of you are present in the jury room. Gentlemen.
All rise.
Jury out at 10:21 a.m.
Let's take 15 minutes. Joe Dye, you can go off the record.
Off record at 10:21 a.m.